Joining us to talk more about space exploration is Jason Davis. He is digital editor for the Planetary Society in Tucson, Arizona. Jason, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Karina.
Well, listen, traditionally, the United States and Russia have been the global leaders of space exploration, but what do you make of China's recent mission? Do you think it could be poised to become a leader as well?
I think so. You look at China's progress since launching their first astronaut back in 2003. It's been very methodical and focused. They launched their first space station, Tiangong-1, and sent a crew up there for 15 days. Now this mission will double that, which is a pretty big step forward for them. And all of this, as you mentioned earlier, is paving the way for their larger 3-module station in 2020. And also when you look at sheer statistics, China, the United States, and Russia now regularly occupy the top 3 spots in terms of the number of launches conducted per year. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that China has arrived on the global spaceflight stage.
Certainly catching up. Well, the U.S. Congress, though, Jason, recently held a hearing titled, "Are We Losing the Space Race to China?" Do you think it should be viewed as a race?
Yeah, I recently wrote an article about this for the Planetary Society, and you can read it at planetary.org. But my answer to that question was no, it doesn't fit the traditional narrative of the space race as it was used in the 50s and 60s between the Soviet Union and the United States. For one thing, there's not this soft power struggle going on to gain the high ground in outer space as a proxy for a real war and kind of this global ideological struggle. But also, the United States and China have very different goals when it comes to space. NASA right now is focused on Mars pretty singularly, and China's efforts right now are focused on the moon.
Right. Well, China does envision both landing on the far side of the moon, but also sending a rover to Mars by 2020. Do you think it's likely to accomplish these goals in just 4 years from now?
Yes, I do. And the reason for that is that the rover and the lander on the far side will largely be based on the technology that was used for Chang'e 3, which is the lander and rover that landed on the near side of the moon. So they already have some experience there. The big hurdle for them will be to place a communications satellite in lunar orbit or near the moon to relay satellite signals to the far side of the moon. Because when you're trying to talk to a spacecraft on the far side of the moon from Earth, you can't send your signal through the moon, so you need to bounce it off of something to get to your spacecraft on the other side. But based on their progress today with their science missions, I think it's very feasible for them to pull it off.
A definite possibility. Okay, well, in the United States, as you mentioned, the focus for NASA is really on Mars. And President Barack Obama recently said by 2030, he expects we will be able to send people to the red planet and have them return safely. When do you expect to see a man on Mars? Is this really feasible by 2030?
Yeah, well, I guess we should note it could be just as easily a woman on Mars, and wouldn't that
Absolutely.
be a really big step forward for gender equality? But yeah, the big question for NASA is whether or not they can maintain the political momentum and the funding needed to sustain a program for that long. When you look at 2 decades and you divide that by elections in the United States every 2 years, that's a lot of different political wins that NASA has to navigate in order to make it all the way there. So that's really the big limiting factor for them. In terms of the technology, I think absolutely they'll be able to do it. Maybe more realistically towards the end of the 2030s. But yeah, if they can keep the funding on track, then yes, it's very feasible for them to do it.
Right. Well, Jason, I mean, the funding was really the reason why they ended their space shuttle program in 2011. Private enterprise, though, is kind of making up for that drop in funding from the government. What role do you think private enterprise will be playing in the new frontier in tourism in space?
Yes, so SpaceX just made a lot of headlines by announcing their grand vision, or SpaceX CEO Elon Musk really announcing his grand vision to colonize Mars, which is a different goal than what NASA actually has in terms of research. But it will probably look something like these kind of public-private partnerships that you're already seeing between commercial space and government space. SpaceX right now, a large percentage of their work is to ferry cargo to the International Space Station. So that's really been kind of their bread and butter getting going, is to provide these missions and get these contracts from NASA. And so as NASA moves out to kind of cislunar space, they call it, the area around the moon, as they prepare to go to Mars, it's very likely you'll continue to see these partnerships continue, that it might be a combination of these partnerships that ultimately get us to Mars.
All right, well, it's one thing to get a man or a woman on Mars, for that matter, but another thing when we're talking about space tourism, I mean, that's something that a lot of wealthy individuals have wanted to participate in. There were some who went to the International Space Station, but that has since stopped. When do you expect, though, that to pick up again, and what will it look like?
Yeah, so in terms of the International Space Station, we almost were there last year. The British singer Sarah Brightman was almost back on the International Space Station as a space tourist. She backed out at the last minute for personal reasons, but you know, with the United States now going to not be relying on the Russian Soyuz to get up to the space station, you can be sure that the Russians are going to be looking for other financial options there, and space tourism, I would expect, might be a part of that. Of course, that's the high end of the spectrum, the kind of super wealthy. On the lower end, we have companies like Virgin Galactic wanting to do suborbital flights for about $250,000 a flight. And you know, at one point they had, I believe, 700 customers signed up for that. We kind of have this axiom in the space community that flights like that are about 2 years away, no matter when you ask. We say they're 2 years away, and then in 2 years you ask us again, and they say another 2 years. So it's really hard to say, but you know, it's reasonable to say that you know, within 5 years maybe we could start seeing some regular tourist flights.
Well, $250,000 is still out of reach for most, but thank you so much. That was Jason Davis, digital editor for the Planetary Society in Tucson, Arizona.